As the conflict between guerrillas and Tajera escalated into a full-scale war, the world watched with bated breath, witnessing the devastating effects of a strategy that had not been seen on such a scale since the darkest days of the 20th century. Ruda, the ambitious and ruthless leader of guerrillas, had decided to escalate the conflict using a military tactic that had once brought Europe to its knees: blitzkrieg. The blitzkrieg strategy unleashed. Blitzkrieg, or lightning war, was a military strategy that focused on rapid, overwhelming attacks designed to incapacitate the enemy before they had time to mount an effective defense. The tactic combined the coordinated efforts of infantry, armored divisions, and air power to break through enemy lines, encircle forces, and destroy their ability to resist. It was a strategy that had been perfected by the Nazi military during the early years of World War II, leading to the swift and devastating conquests of Poland, France, and other European nations. Ruda, having studied the historical applications of blitzkrieg, saw in it a means to achieve a quick and decisive victory over Tajera. He knew that the prolonged missile assaults had already weakened Tajera's infrastructure and military capabilities. Now, he planned to deliver the final blow, a coordinated, multi-pronged assault that would overwhelm Tajera's defenses and bring the nation to its knees. In a high-level meeting with his top generals, Ruda laid out his plan with chilling precision. The room was filled with the sharp scent of tobacco and the low hum of conversation as the generals, veterans of countless battles, listened intently to their leader's strategy. "We will strike with the full might of our forces," Ruda began, his voice cold and calculating. "Our tanks and mechanized infantry will lead the charge, supported by a relentless barrage from our air force. The objective is simple: we will break through Tajera's defenses, encircle their forces, and annihilate them before they can regroup." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "We will leave them no time to think, no time to breathe. By the time they realize what has hit them, it will be too late. This war will be over before they have a chance to comprehend it." The generals nodded in agreement, their faces set in grim determination. They knew what was at stake and were prepared to execute Ruda's plan with ruthless efficiency. The assault begins. As dawn broke over Tajera, the skies were filled with the roar of guerrillist aircraft. Bombers and fighter jets streaked across the horizon, their engines screaming as they delivered a withering barrage of bombs and missiles on Tajera's remaining military installations. The ground shook with the force of the explosions, sending plumes of smoke and debris into the air. Below, guerrillists' armored divisions began their advance. Tanks and armored personnel carriers, bristling with weapons, rolled forward in a seemingly unstoppable tide. The earth trembled beneath their treads as they surged across the border, crushing anything in their path. The infantry followed close behind, their faces hardened by the knowledge of what was to come. They moved with the precision of a well-oiled machine, their weapons ready as they prepared to engage the enemy. Tajera's defenses, already weakened by the relentless missile assaults, struggled to hold the line. Anti-tank guns fired desperately at the advancing armor, while infantry units dug in, preparing for the onslaught. But the sheer speed and ferocity of the guerrillist assault caught them off guard. In the skies above, Tajera's air force scrambled to respond, but they were quickly outmatched by the superior numbers and technology of guerrillists' air power. Dogfights erupted as Tajera's pilots fought valiantly to protect their homeland, but they were overwhelmed by the swarms of enemy aircraft. The blitzkrieg strategy was working. Within hours, guerrillist forces had broken through Tajera's defensive lines and were pushing deep into the heart of the country. Entire divisions were encircled and cut off from reinforcements, their only options being to surrender or face annihilation. President Wiz's desperation. In the Tajera command center, President Wiza watched in horror as reports of the advancing guerrillist forces poured in. The maps before him, once a sea of defensive positions and strongholds, were now marked with the red arrows of guerrillists' advance, pushing ever closer to the capital. "What's the status of our reserves?" Wiza demanded, his voice tight with the strain of command. "Deployed, Mr. President," replied one of his generals, his face ashen. "But they're being hit hard. We're losing ground faster than we can reinforce it." Wiza slammed his fist on the table in frustration. "Damn it! We can't let them reach the capital. We need to slow them down, give our people time to evaluate. Another general spoke up, his voice grim. We're doing everything we can, Mr. President, but their strategy is, it's like nothing we've faced before. They're moving too fast. Wizard knew the general was right. The Blitzkrieg strategy was designed to overwhelm, to create confusion and chaos that would cripple the enemy's ability to respond. And it was working all too well. Then we need to adapt, Wizard said, his voice steely with resolve. If they want to fight a war of speed, we'll make them fight for every inch of ground. Set up ambushes, use the terrain to our advantage. Turn every street, every building into a fortress. He looked around the room, meeting the eyes of each of his commanders. We will not let them take this country. We will fight them with everything we have. And if we have to, we'll make them pay for every drop of Tajera's blood with 10 of their own. The battle rages on. As the Blitzkrieg assault continued, the battle for Tajera grew ever more desperate. Guerrillist forces advanced relentlessly, their tanks smashing through Tajera's defenses and their infantry sweeping through towns and villages. The once vibrant cities of Tajera were transformed into war zones, with buildings reduced to rubble and streets littered with the wreckage of war. But despite the overwhelming odds, Tajera's defenders fought back with a tenacity that surprised even their enemies. In the ruins of their cities, they set up ambushes and defensive positions, turning every street corner into a potential death trap for the advancing guerrillist forces. In one particularly fierce engagement, a group of Tajera soldiers, cut off from their main forces, dug in on the outskirts of a small town. As guerrillist tanks approached, the soldiers waited until they were within range before unleashing a barrage of anti-tank missiles. The first tank exploded in a ball of fire, its crew scrambling to escape as the vehicle burned. The second was disabled by a well-placed shot, its tracks blown off, leaving it stranded in the middle of the street. But for every tank they destroyed, another two took its place. The soldiers knew they were outnumbered, outgunned, and surrounded. But they fought on, driven by the knowledge that they were fighting for their homes, their families, and their country. The battle raged for hours, the air thick with smoke and the stench of burning fuel. By the time the sun set, the town was little more than a smoldering ruin, and the Tajera defenders had been forced to retreat. But they had inflicted heavy losses on their enemies, and they had bought their country precious time. The human cost. As the days passed and the Blitzkrieg continued, the human cost of the conflict became increasingly apparent. Tajera's hospitals were overwhelmed with the wounded, their halls filled with the cries of the injured and the dying. Doctors and nurses worked tirelessly, but there were simply too many casualties and too few resources to treat them all. In the towns and cities that had been overrun by guerrillist forces, the civilian population suffered terribly. Homes were destroyed, families were torn apart, and the specter of death loomed over every street. Those who could fled the advancing forces, seeking refuge in the countryside or in neighboring nations. But many had nowhere to go, and they were left to endure the horrors of war with no end in sight. Despite the devastation, the spirit of resistance remained strong among the people of Tajera. In the face of overwhelming odds, they refused to surrender. Stories of heroism and sacrifice spread like wildfire, inspiring others to join the fight or to support those who were on the front lines. Ruda's overconfidence. Back in Guerrillist, Ruda watched the progress of his Blitzkrieg strategy with satisfaction. His forces were advancing rapidly, and Tajera's defenses were crumbling under the pressure. He believed that victory was within his grasp, that it was only a matter of time before Tajera would be forced to capitulate. But in his confidence, Ruda failed to see the cracks that were beginning to form in his grand plan. The rapid advance of his forces, while effective, had stretched his supply lines thin. The resistance of Tajera's defenders, while not enough to stop his advance, was slowing it down, buying time for Wizards to regroup and for international allies to come to Tajera's aid. Ruda's generals, too, began to voice concerns about the sustainability of the Blitzkrieg strategy. They were pushing their troops to the limit, and the strain was beginning to show. But Ruda, blinded by his ambition, dismissed their concerns, confident that victory was within reach. The tide begins to turn. As the blitzkrieg continued, the international community began to take notice of the conflict. Nations that had initially remained neutral began to express concern about guerrillists' aggressive tactics and the devastation being wrought upon Tajera. Calls for diplomatic intervention grew louder, and pressure mounted on Ruda to bring the conflict to a swift conclusion. But Ruda, driven by his desire for conquest, ignored these calls. He believed that he could crush Tajera before the international community could take meaningful action, and that once he had victory, the world would have no choice but to accept his terms. In Tajera, President Wizard continued to rally his people, even as the situation grew more dire. He knew that the blitzkrieg strategy was designed to break their will, to force them to surrender before they could mount an effective defense. But he also knew that if they could hold out long enough, they might just be able to turn the tide. And so, the battle for Tajera raged on, with both sides locked in a desperate struggle for survival. The storm of annihilation had been unleashed, and only time would tell which side would emerge victorious from the maelstrom of war. It is a story of war, of the clash of wills, and of the human spirit's determination to survive in the face of overwhelming odds. As the conflict continues to escalate, the fate of Tajera hangs in the balance, and the world watches as the storm of war continues to rage. Pride before the fall. As the guerrillist forces continued their relentless advance through Tajera, leaving devastation and despair in their wake, the air grew thick with the smoke of war. Cities that once stood as symbols of Tajera's strength and resilience were reduced to rubble, their streets littered with the remnants of a proud nation struggling to survive. President Wiza, watching from the safety of his war room, could see the grim reality of the situation unfolding before him. His people were dying, his country was crumbling, and the enemy seemed unstoppable. In this moment of crisis, President Wiza faced a crucial decision. The pressure to find a way out of the escalating conflict weighed heavily on him, but his pride and determination to defend Tajera's sovereignty remained unshaken. He had spent his entire career fighting for the independence and dignity of his nation, and the thought of surrendering to the guerrillists, of becoming a vassal state under their rule, was anathema to him. Yet, as the death toll rose and the destruction spread, he was forced to confront the harsh reality. Tajera was on the brink of annihilation. With a heavy heart, Wiza called a meeting of his top advisors, including the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Wizu. Wizu, a seasoned diplomat with a deep understanding of the geopolitical landscape, had long been advocating for a diplomatic solution to the crisis. He knew that the military situation was untenable and that the only way to save Tajera from complete destruction was through negotiation. As the meeting began, Wiza looked around the room at the faces of his advisors. They were weary, their eyes haunted by the horrors of war, but they remained loyal to their president, ready to follow his lead no matter where it took them. Wiza cleared his throat, his voice heavy with emotion as he addressed the room. "We are facing an enemy that shows no mercy," Wiza began, his voice resolute. "The guerrillists have made it clear that they will stop at nothing to achieve their goals. Our military is doing everything it can to hold the line, but we are running out of options. We must consider all possible avenues to save our nation." The room fell silent as the weight of Wiza's words sank in. For a moment, no one spoke, each person grappling with the gravity of the situation. Finally, it was Wizu who broke the silence, his voice calm and measured as he stepped forward. "Mr. President," Wizu began, choosing his words carefully, "I believe it is time for us to consider a diplomatic resolution to this conflict. We have suffered greatly, and while our soldiers fight bravely, the cost of continued resistance is too high. I propose that we approach President Ruto with an offer to become a vassal state under guerrillist rule. In exchange, we would retain our sovereignty and spare our people from further bloodshed." Wiza's eyes narrowed as he listened to Wizu's proposal. The very idea of surrendering to Ruta, of placing Tajera under the control of a tyrant, was repugnant to him. He could feel the anger rising within him, but he forced himself to remain calm, to listen to his advisor's reasoning. Wiza said slowly, "Do you truly believe that surrendering to Ruto will save Tajera? Do you think that he will honor such an agreement, that he will allow us to retain our sovereignty while he consolidates his power? I cannot believe that a man like Ruta, who has shown nothing but contempt for our people, would keep such a promise." Weezu nodded, understanding Wiz's reluctance. "I understand your concerns, Mr. President," he replied. "But the alternative is continued war, continued suffering. Our military cannot hold out indefinitely. We have to think about the future, about the lives we can still save. A vassal state may not be ideal, but it is better than total destruction." Wiz clenched his fists, his knuckles turning white as he considered Weezu's words. Every fiber of his being rebelled against the idea of surrendering, of bowing to the guerrillists. But he knew that Weezu was right about one thing: the war was unwinnable. The guerrillists were too powerful, their forces too numerous. Continuing to fight would only lead to more death, more devastation. But pride, that insidious force, clouded Wiz's judgment. The thought of going down in history as the president who surrendered to Tajera, who allowed it to become a puppet state under guerrillist control, was unbearable to him. His legacy, his entire career, would be tarnished by such a decision. "No," Wiz finally said, his voice firm. "I will not surrender to Tajera Teruta. I will not allow our nation to become a vassal state under his rule. We will fight on, no matter the cost. Our people deserve better than to live under the thumb of a tyrant." Weezu looked at Wizzo with a mixture of sadness and resignation. He had known that this would be Wiz's decision, that the president's pride would not allow him to consider surrender. But he had hoped, for the sake of the people, that Wizzo might see reason. "Mr. President," Weezu said softly, "I respect your decision, but I fear that it will lead to more suffering, more loss. I hope that you will reconsider before it is too late." Wiz shook his head, his expression set in stone. "There is nothing to reconsider, Weezu. This is our fight, and we will see it through to the end." With a heavy heart, Weezu nodded and stepped back, knowing that there was nothing more he could do. He had tried to find a way out, to save his people from the horrors of war, but his efforts had been in vain. All that remained now was to prepare for the inevitable. The war continues. As the days turned into weeks, the war dragged on, with both sides suffering heavy losses. The once proud cities of Tajera were reduced to ashes, their streets filled with the bodies of the dead and the dying. The guerrillists, emboldened by their victories, pushed deeper into Tajera, their forces overwhelming the remaining pockets of resistance. In the guerrillist capital, Rudo watched with satisfaction as his plan unfolded. He had always known that Wizzo would refuse to surrender, that his pride and stubbornness would drive him to continue the fight even in the face of certain defeat. And now, with Tajera on the brink of collapse, Ruda's ambitions were within reach. But even as victory seemed assured, Ruda could not help but feel a twinge of frustration. He had hoped that Tajera's leaders would see reason, that they would submit to his rule without the need for further bloodshed. He had offered them a way out, a chance to save their people, but they had refused. And so, the war continued, with all its horrors and tragedies. In Tajera, the people suffered under the weight of the ongoing conflict. Families were torn apart, homes destroyed, and lives shattered by the relentless advance of the guerrillist forces. The once vibrant nation was now a shadow of its former self, its spirit crushed by the horrors of war. But despite the devastation, there were those who continued to resist, who refused to give in to despair. In the ruins of their cities, they fought on, driven by the belief that their cause was just, that they were fighting not just for themselves, but for the future of their nation. The final reckoning. As the war ground on, President Wizza found himself increasingly isolated, both politically and personally. His refusal to consider surrender had alienated many of his advisors, who saw the futility of the continued conflict. But Wizza remained resolute, convinced that he was doing what was right for Tajera. In the end, it was this pride, this refusal to compromise, that would be his downfall. The guerrillists, relentless in their pursuit of victory, continued their advance, cutting off Tajera's remaining supply lines and encircling its last strongholds. The situation grew increasingly desperate, with no hope of relief in sight. Finally, as the last of Tajera's defenses crumbled, Wizza was forced to confront the harsh reality of his situation. The war was lost, his nation in ruins, and his people suffering beyond measure. And all of it, he realized with a bitter pang, was the result of his own stubbornness, his own refusal to consider another path. In the end, Wiz's pride would lead not to victory, but to ruin. And as the guerrillists marched into the capital, their banners flying high, Wiz could only watch with despair as the nation he had fought so hard to protect slipped from his grasp, consumed by the very war he had refused to end. It is a story of pride, stubbornness, and the high cost of war, as Tajera's once proud leader grapples with the consequences of his actions, leading his nation down a path of destruction and despair. The Gathering Storm. As the guerrillist forces pressed on with their relentless invasion of Tajera, the tides of war began to surge across the continent, sweeping nations into a conflict they had long sought to avoid. President Lysan of Leonias, a seasoned leader with a keen eye for strategy, recognized the growing threat that guerrillist expansion posed not just to Tajera but to the entire region. Lysan understood that if Tajera fell, Leonias would be the next target, and the guerrillists would not stop until their influence extended across the continent. Determined to prevent this outcome, Lysan made the difficult decision to reinforce Tajera's borders, sending troops and resources to support their beleaguered ally. It was a risky move, one that carried the potential to drag Leonias deeper into the conflict, but Lysan knew that the stakes were too high to remain idle. The survival of Leonias, and indeed, the stability of the entire region, depended on keeping the guerrillists at bay. However, as Lysan's forces mobilized to aid Tajera, the situation took an unexpected and devastating turn. Leopardia, a close ally of the guerrillists and a nation with a formidable military, launched a surprise attack on Leonias. The timing was impeccable, catching Leonias off guard and diverting their attention from the task of supporting Tajera. Leopardia's military, having been trained in the ruthless blitzkrieg tactics perfected by the guerrillists, moved with lightning speed and precision. The initial assault was devastating, with Leopardian forces smashing through Leonias' defenses in a matter of days. Despite Leonias' preparedness, they were no match for the sheer ferocity and coordination of Leopardia's attack. In the capital of Leonias, President Lysan watched in horror as reports flooded in of cities falling to the Leopardian advance. The strategic importance of Leonias' position, nestled between Tajera and the heart of the continent, made it a prime target for the guerrillists' expansionist ambitions. Now, with Leopardia acting as their proxy, the guerrillists had effectively neutralized one of the key obstacles to their dominance. But Lysan was not one to back down in the face of adversity. With his nation under siege, he quickly shifted his focus from aiding Tajera to defending Leonias' own borders. He ordered a full mobilization of Leonias' military forces, directing them to fortify key positions and prepare for a prolonged conflict. At the same time, Lysan reached out to neighboring nations, seeking allies who might be willing to join the fight against the growing guerrillist threat. The conflict, once confined to Tajera, now began to spread like wildfire across the continent. As Leonias struggled to repel the Leopardian onslaught, the shockwaves of the invasion reverberated through the region, drawing other nations into the fray. Birais, Hyaenia, and Wolfia, once neutral and peaceful, found themselves caught in the crossfire of a rapidly escalating war. In Birais, President Bjorn held an emergency meeting with his top advisors. The country had long prided itself on its neutrality, preferring diplomacy and trade over military engagement. But with the guerrillists now threatening to dominate the entire continent, Bjorn faced an impossible choice: remain neutral and risk being overrun, or take up arms and join the growing coalition against the guerrillists. The debates within the Berizian government were heated. Some argued for immediate action, pointing out that the guerrillists would not stop until they had subjugated the entire region. Others urged caution, fearing that joining the war would only bring destruction to Birais' peaceful cities. In the end, Bjorn made the fateful decision to begin secret negotiations with Leonias and Tajera, seeking a way to join the fight without openly declaring war until the time was right. Meanwhile, in Hyaenia, President Murray faced a similar dilemma. Hyaenia had already been drawn into the conflict, having suffered attacks from guerrillist forces in the early stages of the war. The nation's military had managed to repel the initial assaults, but Murray knew that it was only a matter of time before the guerrillists regrouped and struck again. With Tajera on the brink of collapse and Leonias under siege, Murray recognized that the balance of power was rapidly shifting in favor of the guerrillists. Reluctantly, Murray began to prepare Hyaenia for a broader conflict, reaching out to neighboring nations to form a defensive alliance. The stakes were higher than ever, and Murray understood that Hyenia's survival depended on forging new alliances and standing firm against the guerrillist juggernaut. In Wolfia, President Hyza found himself in a precarious position. The nation, known for its fierce independence and well-trained military, had managed to avoid direct involvement in the conflict thus far. But with the war now threatening to engulf the entire continent, Hyza could no longer afford to remain on the sidelines. As the guerrillists continued their advance, Hyza convened a council of war, bringing together the leaders of Wolfia's military and intelligence agencies. The discussions were tense, with some advocating for a preemptive strike against guerrillist forces to prevent them from gaining a foothold in Wolfia. Others urged caution, pointing out that Wolfia's position as a neutral power could be leveraged to broker a peace agreement. In the end, Hyza opted for a more cautious approach, ordering the military to begin fortifying Wolfia's borders while continuing to explore diplomatic options. But even as Wolfia prepared for the worst, Hyza knew that the time for neutrality was rapidly running out. The guerrillists showed no signs of slowing their advance, and Wolfia's future hung in the balance. A continent on the brink. As the fires of war spread across the continent, the once stable political landscape was thrown into chaos. Alliances were tested, old rivalries reignited, and nations that had once stood together now found themselves at odds. The conflict, which had begun as a struggle between Tajera and the guerrillists, had grown into a full-blown continental war, with no end in sight. In the guerrillist capital of Hunxi, President Ruda watched the unfolding events with a mixture of satisfaction and determination. His plan was working. By drawing Leonias, Leopardia, and the other nations into the conflict, he had effectively isolated Tajera and weakened any potential resistance. With Tajera's defenses crumbling and Leonias struggling to repel the Leopardian assault, Ruda knew that the time was right to push forward with his ultimate goal, the unification of the continent under the guerrillist banner. But even as Ruda reveled in his successes, he could not ignore the growing signs of dissent within his own ranks. The war, which had initially united the guerrillist people under a banner of nationalism and expansionism, was beginning to take its toll. Casualties were mounting, and the once enthusiastic populace was growing weary of the constant conflict. In private, some of Ruda's closest advisors began to voice their concerns. The war was dragging on longer than anticipated, and the costs, both in terms of resources and lives, were mounting. While Ruda remained confident in his strategy, he could not afford to ignore the growing discontent. He knew that in order to maintain his grip on power, he needed a decisive victory, one that would cement his legacy and silence his critics. Meanwhile, in Tajera, President Wizard continued to grapple with the harsh realities of the war. The once proud nation was now a shadow of its former self, its cities in ruins and its people demoralized. The desperate attempts to defend the capital, Tiz, were becoming increasingly futile as guerrillist forces closed in from all sides. Wizard knew that Tajera's days were numbered. The relentless guerrillist advance, coupled with the loss of support from Leonias, had left the nation vulnerable and isolated. But even in the face of overwhelming odds, Wizard refused to give up. He continued to rally his people, urging them to fight on, to resist the guerrillists with every ounce of strength they had left. In a final, defiant act, Wizard ordered a series of counterattacks against guerrillist forces, hoping to buy enough time to negotiate a ceasefire or secure aid from the remaining neutral nations. But the reality was clear. Tajera was on the brink of collapse, and the guerrillists were poised to deliver the final blow. As the war entered its most critical phase, the continent stood at a crossroads. The choices made by its leaders in the coming days would determine the fate of nations, shaping the course of history for generations to come. The conflict, now a full-scale continental war, had taken on a life of its own, with no clear path to peace in sight. The battle for Tiz. In the days that followed, the battle for Tiz reached a fever pitch. guerrillist forces, bolstered by Leopardian reinforcements, launched a massive assault on the capital, determined to break through Tajera's final line of defense. The fighting was intense, with both sides suffering heavy casualties as they battled for control of the city. Inside the besieged city, President Wiza made a final, desperate appeal to the international community, calling on the remaining neutral nations to intervene and prevent the fall of Tiz. But the response was tepid at best, with most nations unwilling to risk their own security by becoming embroiled in the conflict. In the end, Tiz fell to the guerrillists, marking a decisive victory for Ruda and his forces. The once vibrant capital was now a smoldering ruin, its streets littered with the wreckage of war. For Tajera, the fall of Tiz signaled the end of the war and the beginning of a new chapter in its history, one defined by occupation, subjugation, and the loss of sovereignty. Echoes of defeat. After more than a year of unrelenting conflict, Tajera, once a beacon of resilience and pride, fell to the unstoppable might of the guerrillist forces. The battle-scarred streets of Tiz, Tajera's once thriving capital, now lay in ruins, haunted by the ghostly remnants of what had once been a vibrant metropolis. The devastation was complete, buildings reduced to rubble, lives shattered, and a once proud nation brought to its knees. The final days of the conflict were marked by desperation and despair as President Wiza, his spirit broken by the relentless onslaught, finally surrendered unconditionally to the guerrillists. The surrender was not just a defeat on the battlefield, but a profound humiliation, a bitter acknowledgement of the heavy price paid for Wiza's refusal to entertain Foreign Minister Wizu's earlier plea for diplomatic negotiations. Thousands had perished in the futile defense of their homeland, and Tajera's legacy had been tarnished, its future now in the hands of the conquerors. As the victorious guerrillist army marched triumphantly into Tiz, their morale was bolstered by their success. The soldiers, intoxicated by the glory of their conquest, hailed Ruda as a savior and a saint, their cries of victory echoing through the decimated streets. The once vibrant city now bore the weight of guerrillist nationalism, a city fallen to the fervor of an ideology that sought to dominate all in its path. Ruda, now at the zenith of his power, strode through the ruined streets of Tiz with an air of regal authority. His gaze swept over the wreckage, his heart swelling with the satisfaction of a mission accomplished. To him, the fall of Tajera was not merely a military victory, it was a vindication of his vision, a testament to the righteousness of his cause. He had promised his people expansion, strength, and unity under the guerrillist banner, and he had delivered. As Ruda approached the central square, where the remnants of Tajera's military leadership awaited him, he called upon the defeated Tajera soldiers to lay down their weapons. The time for resistance had passed, and he demanded total submission. The Tajera soldiers, once proud defenders of their homeland, now stood in silence, their spirits crushed, their will to fight extinguished. Amidst the rows of soldiers, Ruda's sharp eyes fell upon a figure whose face stirred a memory. There was something about this soldier, a familiar challenge in his eyes, a defiance that had not been completely stamped out. But Ruda, confident in his dominance, dismissed the flicker of recognition, choosing instead to focus on the grander picture. He had conquered Tajera, now he would shape its future. Ruda's voice, firm and commanding, reverberated through the square as he addressed the people of Tiz. People of Tajera, he began, his tone carrying the weight of a conqueror's authority, today marks the beginning of a new era. No longer will you live under the shadow of a failed leadership. No longer will you suffer the indignities of division and weakness. Under guerrillist rule, you will find strength, unity, and prosperity. I offer you a future where Tajera will rise from the ashes as part of a greater, more powerful nation. The words were meant to inspire hope, to convince the people that their surrender was not the end, but a new beginning. Yet, as Ruda spoke, the mood in the square was far from what he had anticipated. The people of Tiz, their hearts heavy with grief and anger, did not cheer. There was no joy in their eyes, no relief in their expressions. Instead, there was a profound, simmering pain, a collective mourning for a homeland lost, for lives torn apart by the ravages of war. For the people of Tajera, Ruda's declaration was a bitter reminder of their fall from grace. The promises of prosperity and unity under foreign rule rang hollow in their ears. They had not fought and bled to see their country handed over to an outsider, their sovereignty stripped away, their identity subsumed by a conquering power. The pain of defeat was too fresh, the wounds too deep, for them to accept Ruda's vision of the future. As the crowd dispersed, a heavy silence hung over Tiz. The people returned to their broken homes, their thoughts consumed by the enormity of their loss. Families mourned the dead, the streets echoed with the cries of those searching for missing loved ones, and the once proud spirit of Tajera lay in tatters. Meanwhile, in the corridors of the makeshift guerrillist headquarters, discussions about the future of Tajera were underway. The question of Tajera's status, whether it would be a colony under direct guerrillist control or granted some form of autonomy, was hotly debated among Ruda's advisors. Some argued for full annexation, citing the need for complete control to prevent any resurgence of resistance. Others suggested a more nuanced approach, allowing Tajera limited self-governance under strict guerrillist oversight to ease tensions and facilitate smoother integration. Ruda listened to the arguments with a calculated mind. He knew that his decision would have far-reaching consequences, not just for Tajera, but for the stability of his entire empire. The victory had been costly, and maintaining control over a resentful population would require careful planning. Yet, his ambition to expand guerrillist influence across the continent left little room for compromise. Outside the palace, the undercurrents of resistance began to stir. The people of Tajera, though beaten, were not entirely broken. In the shadows, whispers of rebellion spread, and small groups began to organize in secret, determined to resist guerrillist rule by any means necessary. The spirit of Tajera, though bruised, had not been completely extinguished. Ruda, in his triumph, underestimated the depth of Tajera's resolve. He saw the silence of the people as acquiescence, not realizing that beneath the surface, anger and defiance were brewing. The seeds of resistance had been planted, and they would grow in the fertile soil of despair and indignation. As the days passed, the tension in Tiz remained palpable. Guerrillist soldiers patrolled the streets, enforcing the new order with an iron fist, while the people of Tajera quietly mourned their loss. The city, once alive with the vibrant energy of its citizens, now felt hollow, a shell of its former self. In the coming weeks, Ruda would learn that victory on the battlefield did not guarantee peace. The true battle for Tajera was just beginning, and it would be fought not with armies, but with the indomitable will of a people who refused to be conquered.
We're driving me.